My name is Tim Hughes. I'm really pleased to be introducing and moderating the next panel, which is our two presenters are speakers, our colleagues from Brown. John Cayley is Professor of Literary Arts, and in fact, has a book that's imminently to be published called Grammarlepsy, Essays on Digital Language Arts, which is coming out from Bloomsbury in the late spring. His concept is reading, and will be speaking first. Lynn Joyrich is professor and currently chair of Modern Culture and Media and the editor of Camera Obscura, and her concept is television. So we're going to hear from John first, and then Lynn.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Political Concepts for the invitation. I'm going to be reading my paper, and you can read it. And I'm just going to read. You will see what I see. Nobody has to look at that, because it'll be the same, won't it? Won't it? In a way. The president does not read. This statement, my own, is derived from articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times that were published before and after the 2016 election. I might actually have quoted something like it out of context from the title of the Washington Post article, but Trump was not yet president, and I would have been pointedly discarding the adverb much. From the New York Times piece, written after President Trump's, to my mind, oxymoronic elevation, I will, however, quote its writer as telling us, perhaps intending some kind of reassurance, that the president that the president, who does not read books, is able to end his evenings being a television. If you read or write to be read, you tend to take care with words. I don't think it's a coincidence that I have not been able to find writing by experienced journalists from which I could quote the opening statement that I have made in the form that I have made it. Reading is a political concept. It is clear from what I've read, however, that the Trump of this presidency in this edition of our gathering has a problem with reading. He can read, we must assume, but habitually does not. And when he does, he freely admits to being regularly and happily interrupted by far more pressing concerns. He's a very efficient guy, he says. He loves to read, but often only gets to look at his books. Still, he can reach smart decisions, he says, with very little knowledge other than knowledge I already had, plus common sense, because I have a lot of common sense and I have a lot of business ability. The concept of literacy is not at issue here. We are not discussing the sense of reading that can be done by anyone who has been schooled to read. Trump is at least minimally and conventionally literate. We are discussing the reading that presidents are expected to do and may even be admired for doing, the type of reading that is done by the lettered rather than by the merely literate, the type of reading that we do in the university. But if read in my original statement is also a veiled passive, if it is also the case that the president does not read, if he is not and cannot be read by us, then we may have to concede that something more troubling conceptually is being brought to our attention, something that may well have a bearing on literacy as well as on the culture of letters and the reconfiguration of political economy. Attention is the mark in this context of a certain contemporary analysis and critique of reading. The attention economy is an acknowledged aspect of the wider computational economy. As advertising, it monetizes and drives the most powerful and significant enterprises in this realm. The attention economy is enabled by networked and programmable media, and its transactional universe, the internet, provides us with what is arguably the predominant infrastructure for all practices of reading in the developed world, including the reading we do in the university and in the world of letters. The overabundance of information and minimal costs for the production and dissemination of minimally readable texts, however, ensure that the attention economy is characterized by overload, segmentation, and distraction. At least in terms of temporality, human attention is finite, and thus overproducers must compete for a type of consumption that is intended to yield, ultimately, commercial transaction of some sort. If we read within these infrastructural software architectures, then inevitably we read in some new and different way, and this must be the case a fortiori for those of us who have been educated more or less exclusively in the brave new world of our encompassing infrastructure. Stated simply, in a world now driven by vectoralized attention, fueling the computation economy, reading is changing or has changed. Higher journalism and popular nonfiction have gone so far as to assemble evidence for a cognitive degeneration that is produced by this change in reading. It becomes stupid reading, shallow reading. This resonates in contemporary critical thought with the political economic degradation of systematic stupidity. For Bernard Stiegler, who warns us of this condition, there is, however, a crucial choice that all of us may make with regard to developments in the techniques of culture as instigated by corporate capital, even when neoliberalism guarantees that these developments are overdetermined by short-termism and benefits defined more or less exclusively in terms of self-centered individuality, instrumentality, and profit. If we adapt to these techniques, we consume the pharmacon of networked computational information and infrastructure as a poison. If we adopt them with care, we may be able to experience new ways of reading, for example, as therapeutic. Along those branches of the humanities that are sensitive to and schooled in contemporary techniques, there is some evidence of a more optimistic, therapeutic reading of contemporary reading. This is best represented in the work of N. Catherine Hales, who established a distinction between reading that is either deep or hyper, qualifiers which are also applied to attention. In subsequent work, it is clear that deep and hyper are to be seen as non-exclusive modes of reading practice, and Hales goes on to add a third mode, that of machine reading. She claims generative synergies between all these varieties of reading, and while keeping faith with the close and deep reading of traditional humanities and higher education in general, she proposes that hyper-reading may be a sensitive, nuanced, effective human and humanities response to the information economy and computational culture, a matter perhaps of adoption rather than adaptation. Hales is, moreover, concerned to emphasize the role of what she now designates as, quote, non-conscious cognitive processes in human experience generally, and in particular for reading as hermeneutic, aesthetic, and scientific project. Those underlying aspects of synergistic readings that are, in Hales' accounts, non-conscious, allow her to accommodate analogous or speculatively identical aspects of machine reading, for example, inferences from the quantitative analyses of distant reading, which exploit computation's ability to process the big data of linguistically motivated tokens at velocities that greatly exceed the temporalities of human attention, to the extent that most machine reading takes place more or less beyond the horizon of human perception, let alone consciousness. Whatever the merits of the case for such new and alternate modalities of reading, implied by synergies such as those that Hales proposes, these are all analyses of one particular understanding of reading, most summarily designated as the reading of typographically instantiated text. The prehistory, techniques, and archive of print culture are presupposed by the reading of text, and it is the contemporary ubiquity of newer techniques exceeding those of print that have caused us to challenge the much analyzed traditional concept of reading. If print were not under threat, then it would be far less likely that we should imagine that reading faced any sort of existential crisis. But without referring to linguistic literacy, what if we were to consider the possibility that a more fundamental conception of reading is being subjected historically to existential challenge? That rather than trying to determine whether, for example, Trump's failure to read books might be redeemed by multimodal, synergistic, but relatively shallow practices of deep, hyper, and machine reading, we were to accuse him of an even more troubling reading failure, one that might be expressed in a statement such as, "The president does not read in our own or anyone else's language." What if we were to take into consideration a concept of reading that has been comprehended, that has comprehended certain implication of Jacques Derrida's of grammatology, and goes on to reconfigure reading as, straightforwardly, that which brings human language into being? Etymologically, reading and to read are well positioned to bear this ontological burden, deriving from cognates used to suggest something like the ability to make well-advised, convincing guesses, particularly concerning utterances and other forms of signifying trace. In contemporary English, we have no one word for to hear and understand as language, and I suggest that reading and to read can and should serve as such. The move in my argument that disregards philosophically differences with regard to the two operative support media for language, orality and visuality, speech and writing, is deliberate, and I take it to be authorized by the insights of Derridian grammatology. One of Derrida's crucial arguments reconfigures the logic of the supplement, especially with respect to structural linguistics, and its paradoxical misapprehension of writing as at once secondary to speech, while pragmatically supplying primary research materials for its syntactic, morphological, lexicographic, and often even phonological analyses. I take seriously Derrida's thesis, as I read it, meticulously traced through his close reading of Rousseau, that language comes into being as, in a sense, the supplement, foreclosing all but our delusions of full, authentic speech, or of language as brought forth by presence and invested with its manifest, authoritative meanings. Any speculative first speech, and simultaneously all speech, requires readings from its speakers and from any others who know a language. The participation of others in community with ourselves is an equally essential aspect of the constitutive events. There is no way that any of the readings that we do, inherently the supplement of natural, evoking Rousseau, human experience, can be identified with anything which supports them materially or to which they refer by conventions of différence, or, for that matter, difference. It is the readings themselves that constitute language and that allow us to grasp its elements and to know, in some sense, that we have language as a faculty. To flesh out this concept of reading, I characterize it as grammaleptic, seizing the gramme, and designate the process by which it brings language into being as grammalepsis. Grammalepsis comprises all of those numberless human encounters with indeterminate but perceptible artificial forms and gestures that resolve themselves into the readable gramme of language as it is grasped, collectively understood, and as it becomes suddenly the readable phenomena in and of our world where it had not been before. Framed by constitutive reading, our perspective on what language is, ontologically, shifts to coincide with what we can grasp of language as we read. This all but tautological statement has significant consequences. It implies that language is something that human beings perform together in productive and receptive acts of reading. And because such reading is, to the extent of our current knowledge, unique to our species, this is a radically humanist view of language. Regardless of its humanism, grammaleptic reading, as what brings language to be in the world, is applied by definition to our evolved faculty of language. And as such, it is applied equally to what Walter Ong calls primary orality. Whereas historically, our common sense of reading has been overwritten by history itself, by the spectacular cultural and political economic success of literacy. Myself, I would go so far as to claim that history is the linguistic imperialism of what Ong, following earlier scholars, calls grapholects, that all writing and common sense reading, the grammaleptic reading of graphic traces, is practiced in what is properly understood as another language, or at least a distinct dialect with respect to any practice of language as speech, however correspondent. So that, I mean, I would go so far as to say that what I'm doing as I perform the paper is sort of in a different language or a different dialect to what you read as you read there. But you need not agree with this position to see that learning the language of literacy has convinced us, correctly, despite the misdirection, that graphically represented differences of writing are all that we need to read language into being. And because these differences present themselves as the discrete, graphically abstracted idealities of orthography, remember that orthography is recent, right? We have, since structuralism, and particularly since the advent of post-war computation, tended to assume that the operations of language are homologous with those of formal language, in quotation marks. That the infinite expressiveness of language is merely a function of combinatorial operations on finite sets of structured linguistic elements. That's Chomsky, right? It was Derrida that showed us conclusively the inadequacy of this position. Différence that may be invisible, inaudible, or properly stated in the terms of this argument, unreadable, when expressed in one support medium, or from with any phenomenological horizon of perception, enter at every moment into the serious play of reading and of language. This differs, even in terms of countability, by several orders of magnitude, if it does not rule out the possibility that différences are finite. The question is, who will decide, us or the robots? And will this decision be made beyond our horizon of perception? Whatever the robots may perceive as readable, and we will not, one of the most important consequences of framing linguistic ontology in terms of grammaleptic reading is now perceptible to us. We can appreciate that the entire discourse of new, changed, degenerate, synergistic, multimodal reading is constrained by its concern for the reading of written, graphically recorded text. When this text is subjected to deep or hyper-reading, this may well be reading in terms of one or more practices of human language. But even so, these readings will orbit structured differences that are graphically or typographically instantiated. When it comes to machine reading, these differences are encoded as transcriptions of graphic differences and nothing more. Currently, including at the bleeding edge of machine learning, these are the only differences that count as so-called data. Whole realms of différence in language remain literally unreadable to computation. That needs to be qualified, of course, but these circumstances foreclose neither certain types of computational data-driven inference concerning whatever remains literally unreadable to computation in text produced by humans, nor varieties of relation and engagement across human non-conscious reading and whatever it is that computation is being trained by machine learning to do with the tokens of literacy. What we can say, however, is that to argue for the adaptation of reading as a whole to machine reading would be as stupid and shallow as to argue for the adaptation of a diverse, complex linguistic culture to a single dialect. We can also be fairly clear, given available sources of investment, that machines are being trained to read, however non-consciously, for reasons that must bias their readings in terms of a commercially motivated relation with transaction, rather than, by way of contrastive example, with beauty or with contemplative thought, or science for that matter. Our smartest machines read in order to promote transaction, and this implies, with respect to the culture and even the history of reading, that they read, at best, in a narrowly focused graphilect, stupidly and shallowly. Trump does not deep read, more or less by his own admission, and he shows no evidence of being able to do so. We can say this with assurance because we are the community of language practice for this reading. Neither does he himself machine read. Actual machine reading is left to his campaign network, which reads and writes data points, records extracted and archived by private corporations, such as indeterminately motivated likes on Facebook. These data points, and we've heard more about we've heard much more interesting material about this earlier from Wendy. These data points can nonetheless be tallied with specific individual citizens in order to translate suggestively, ostensibly anonymous data into tractable, transactable votes. An efficient guy, meanwhile, Trump hyperreads bigly, judging by his inability to hold in mind the names and details of bereaved family members as far as official phone calls. He reads television and book covers, we know, briefings, we surmise, and of course, tweets. We all have access in some manner to his tweets, and we see that they are, to a certain extent, responsive to the other Twitter texts. Twitter is the scene of reading for the Trump presidency. Twitter reconfigures Trump's reading with respect to machine reading. He hyperreads within an infrastructure that is programmatically attuned to machine reading. Twitter will only grasp a highly constrained, though recently doubled, number of symbolic, sublexical virtual linguistic tokens, and human readers adapt to these constraints. This does not entirely foreclose the possibility of grammaleptic reading in a human sense. Human tweeters may well grasp différences that are beyond the horizons of the machine when, reading tweets, they encounter, for example, tone, punning, ellipsis, and style in general. For most readers, including Trump, however, constraint is constraint in this context. And in the last analysis, so as to survive in a world of super corporate winners and losers, the Twitter corpus is, of course, commercially dedicated to big data analyses that build vectors for advertisement and transaction, for, that is, distraction and exploitation. Nonetheless, this Trump edition of the presidency chooses to read and to be read in such circumstances, publicly, with respect to policy and executive action. Personally, in terms of my own critical thought, this implies that Trump reads, as I suggested before, in a language that is no longer in our own or anyone else's. Nonetheless, I contend that the true delusions and degeneracies of these circumstances lie elsewhere, in the construction of a pseudo-public agora, a non-mutual forum for virtual language, where assumptions of presence at the troubled heart of Western metaphysics become a catastrophic tyranny that erases language, and more especially the language of shared polity. That the infrastructure of these circumstances is software architected and supplied with terms of service that are explicitly unequal and non-mutual is not my chief concern here, but requires brief mention. The tweeting entities of @POTUS and @RealDonaldTrump are, for different reasons, granted powers of Twitter presence far, far beyond that of ordinary users. There is no software structural necessity for this. The empowering code is constructed by private corporations that set their own terms of use, establishing artificial institutions of authority and authenticity more or less arbitrarily, particularly with respect to state regulation, which seems typically to intervene in a manner that is responsive and compliant rather than caring or proactive. In the midst of Derrida's close reading of Rousseau, in the second part of Grammatology, there is a section with the title Writing, Political Evil, and Linguistic Evil. Derrida interrogates Rousseau's rendition of a deep-seated prejudice against writing, one that resonates with Plato's rhetorical mnemonic pharmacological warning, but which directly associates writing and political subjection, writing as the deathly, malevolent enslavement of free speech. For Rousseau, the moment of political community is naturally established by societies when all their subjects are present within one another's hearing understanding and are able to affirm in full speech the promises of collectivity. These speech-enabled promises may be destroyed, according to Rousseau and many others, by writing, by the letter that controls without presence and even after death. If we substitute reading for writing in this scenario, reading is equally pertinent to performances of both speech and writing, while acknowledging that reading is, as I have argued, constitutive of language, then Derrida's underlying deconstruction of Rousseau's pathological, paradoxical relationship with writing, political evil, and linguistic evil becomes more construable. Paradox as a crux for deconstructive investment is signaled by Rousseau's reputation as writer par excellence as self-confessed practitioner of the dangerous supplement. It's not that these so-called supplementary practices are themselves unredeemable, or that they necessarily entail political evil. Our pragmatic, ethical, political emphasis must shift so as to care for a less delusional, potentially therapeutic, pharmacological understanding of individual and collective practices of language, regardless of form or dialect. What we need to do is to read better, despite and against delusional infrastructures of culture and political economy. Twitter, social media, and network programmable media generally pretend to make human subjects like the president and the real Donald Trump directly and immediately present, connected in the jargon of the vectorless superpowers, to vast numbers of those persons who make up our institutional collectivities. And for me, it's important that those institutional collectivities are real and plural. And the next sentence, which just is what we are reduced to, it seems to me, is a catastrophe. Addressed regardless of institutional affiliation, as authenticated individual accounts at terminal points of a universal internetwork, those persons, we ourselves, are rendered structurally and psychopolitically complicit with this delusion of presence, willfully ignoring the vectoral corporate infrastructures that deliver celebrity tweets directly to the human faculties attempting to read them. Anyone with privileged access to this inherently delusional infrastructure, delusional in terms of its representation and mediation of presence and absence, is empowered to speak and to read in any language at all, including a singular language like that of @POTUS or @Real Donald Trump. If the president does not read as we do, particularly in these circumstances, this signals a terrifying threat to language and to the political concept of reading. Our reading of the presidency is reduced to the tweets that are delivered to our terminals, and the president himself reads only in an auto-effective narcissolect, the language of someone who will not read anything that does not bear the presence of his name in praise of his delusional authority.
I'm going to have lots of silly pictures going along with silly text. Oh.
No, I'll bring it to you, yeah. Close it up, I'm sorry. It's the second time it's like that.
Oh, is that what's going on?
Or maybe, sorry. It says on this.
He did. It's not letting me even go past the 16 seconds now. Oops. right here. Would you mind? Sorry about that.
What we might do is actually take a question or two for John while we're waiting for the... Bonnie, we spoke too soon about these glitches having been wiped out. While we're waiting for the technical stuff to resolve. So if anyone had any comments or questions for John's fascinating paper. Okay, that always happens.
Are you on?
So with this doing up here now, I use... No. So it's this thing that...
Forward, backward.
Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Can folks hear me?
Hold on, I need to,
Am I not using the mic?
you are.
Okay. Okay. So in an email from the organizers of this wonderful event, so thank you, organizers, participants were told that it would be a good idea to start with a few words about how our concepts and terms typically appear in established understandings of those terms before going on to give our own analyses. Well, my term is television, something that I think would appear to be so etched in our consciousness that it needs no introduction. Indeed, for decades and still today, television has been and continues to be the world's most dominant medium, with studies showing that across all of the available TV receiving screens, people around the globe spend more time watching television than doing almost anything else in their lives, except for or even with working and sleeping, right? So more than watching films, more than reading the newspaper, more than surfing the web, more than eating, chatting, having sex, etc. And yet when I teach my Introduction to Television Studies course, all of the students start off the semester by telling me that no one watches television anymore, despite the fact that as the semester goes on, it becomes clear that they have seen every single television text that I mentioned, from classic era through current programming, across genres, quality, and target markets, on their laptops and phones, if not always on a television set, although they finally admit that, of course, they watch TV that way too, in their dorms, at bars or friends' apartments, for sports games or cult shows, and in their parents' living rooms, yielding aspirations of their own for not only video on mobile devices, but widescreen, high-definition TV displays that they all crave, on which they can watch the latest upcoming series getting all the buzz. As that suggests, in the popular imagination, television is paradoxically both invisible and hypervisible, appearing on giant screens that surround us in, for example, airports, restaurants, and malls, and on miniature ones that, in a sense, we surround, like with handheld devices carried in pockets. Not to mention also, of course, in just the most prosaic of surroundings of people's everyday lives, like TV sets in offices, waiting rooms, and of course, homes. Television is everywhere, and so nowhere in particular, constantly taken, yet taken for granted, marked as our past, present, and future, seemingly far from us, yet always immediately near. That, in fact, is the very meaning of television, television, seeing at a distance, right? And therefore both remote and immediate, a sight, S-I-T-E, and a sight, S-I-G-H-T, a sight and a sight away. Those breach boundaries between the invisible and the overly visible, the near and the far, the immediate and the hypermediatized, are just some of the borders that television crosses. Given its temporalities and spatialities, its narratives and its rhetorics, its techniques and its technologies, television is located at precisely the intersection of the public and the private, the domestic and the social, the everyday and the exceptional, the real and the fantastic. bringing us into the world bringing the worlds into our living areas that we see on screen, right, just as we are brought into those spaces that we see, right, keeping us tuned in through the regular ongoing flow of irregular eventfulness, spectacularizing the ordinary and banalizing the extraordinary, television both comforts and shocks, unites and differentiates, smooths and segments, or maybe more accurately, provides comfort for its own shocks, creates a unity in difference, yields a smoothing continuity through segmented discontinuity, and vice versa. So this paradoxical position, a position in paradox, helps to explain how televisual logic seeps into all areas of our lives, our culture, our concepts, our politics, even as it so often remains unacknowledged, becoming both the obvious and the obscure. So for this edition, the Trump edition of Political Concepts, I aim to highlight, and hopefully not too at this point, obviously, I hope to highlight this televisual logic as it relates to Donald Trump and to our current, what I call the dystrumpia, showing how one might say TV trumps, right? So TV trumps. Okay, so ever since the early morning of November 9th, 2016, when against almost all expectations and seemingly all logic, Donald J. Trump was declared the winner of the 45th US presidential election, it's been repeatedly said that the media failed the public. It is true that the great majority of news reporters and political analysts in the US and transnationally did not predict this result, and thus the more than 71 million television viewers around the world who witnessed Trump's surprising win had good reason to be stunned and shocked. As not only a television studies scholar, but an avid television viewer, I was among those stunned spectators, but while in a sense I was shocked, I was not surprised. I'd been predicting a Trump victory since the very beginning of the US primary season, betting against friends in wagers that I desperately hoped to lose about Trump's success in moving forward through each round of the reality television program that was the 2016 American election. Indeed, it was that televisual structure that led me to my predictions, as it seemed clear that this election was not at all operating within the logic of previous American elections or with what we typically think of as political discourse, right? A discourse presumably centered on platforms, policies, arguments for how to achieve certain goals. Instead, it operated fully through a media logic, through what I call the reality televisualization of political formations. So this is precisely, as I said a moment ago, TV trumps, how TV gains ascendancy over or fully incorporates politics. In that sense, the media did not fail. Rather, the media fully succeeded in producing a particular effect, even if those working in the media did not quite realize this. This is not a simple instrumental effect, right? So in other words, I'm not arguing for any sort of direct, determinist, behavioral view of television, right? I'm not proposing a hypodermic needle model of media effects, but am concerned instead with a kind of televisual epistemology and a televisual affect, with in fact a televisual intertwining of epistemology and affect. So a meshing of modes of thinking and modes of feeling. That stew has become the medium in which politics in the US, along with many other places around the globe, now exist. And I use the word medium here purposely to play out its multiple meanings, right? Not only indicating mediatization, but trying to point also to the scientific sense of medium as the substance in which something lives and is cultured, and even the occult suggestion of emanating and auratic sensations and communications. Within that medium logic of televisualization, and again, particularly reality televisualization, arguments and proofs don't matter. Policy positions and reasoned discourse don't matter. understandings of the division between truth and fantasy, real and unreal, and action and appearance don't matter. What mattered for an American political candidate in the election is what matters for a contestant on reality TV. Constructing oneself as a strongly profiled persona, a kind of branded, celebrified image, right, or as Trump branded himself, winner, while also communicating clearly defined personae for one's opponents, like as he called them Lyin' Ted or Crooked Hillary. What worked in this TV formation, in other words, was the production and enactment of a particular kind of personality, a media personality or brand that, to reference a number of reality TV games and slogans, right, is able to survive on the island and avoid getting fired, to make it work, to come back and perform the next night instead of getting voted off. This is exactly the staple reality televisual personality who shows that he or she is able to manage risks and rewards, to balance alliances and betrayals, to lip sync for your life, to act out in ways that read as both strategic and authentic, or as Trump himself, or more accurately his ghostwriter put it, to engage in truthful hyperbole. By presenting just such a persona, Trump established himself as the idol, the voice, the sole survivor, making it to the end of The Amazing Race, and garnering votes from an audience used to being asked to make its choice in that way. This particular construction of media personality is what in performance and star studies is called personification. Personification involves projecting a persona in which subject and role, private person and public individual, private person and public image, ordinary individual and extraordinary representative, those things become equated and in a way equivocated. Each acts as an alibi for the other, or maybe more accurately, as a kind of mutual guarantee, like a product guarantee. The reality television celebrity can thus stand all at once for himself as subject, for the brand image, and for all the people invited to identify with and feel that brand. The persona becomes effective and affective, marked as authentic despite, or even more so because of the artifice of invention, through the attachments that connect the personality to his or her public. In this way, a focus on the enhanced persona yields a kind of tribal individualism and an individualist tribalism. That loaded term tribal comes from reality television itself, where it's been used to divide contestants and designate teams with which we as viewers are encouraged to affiliate, like with the tribes on the program Survivor, or like by claiming ourselves on, say, Team Bethany or Team Kelly from Real Housewives of New York, or Team Ronnie or Team Situation from Jersey Shore, Team John or Team Kate from John and Kate plus 8. But the notion of tribal individualism and individualist tribalism also perfectly describes Donald Trump's racialized populist nationalism, in which the perceived possibility of individual success binds his affiliated group together rather than separating them, even with the enormous real differences between Trump and his constituents. This is a televisual logic, as television, which, like I said, brings the world and its events into our homes, just as we're invited into the spaces and times of those seen on screen, right? Again, television is located at exactly those borders of public and private, individual and social, sameness and strangeness, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the fantastic and the real. Given Donald Trump's remarkable reality TV instincts in manipulating these categories and the media persona he created for himself, his electoral success was thus not that surprising from a television studies perspective. But of course, winning an election and governing a country are quite different things, demanding, one might argue, different genres and different personae, different characters, if you will. In other words, plural TV Trumps, to play out the other meaning of that phrase. These different characters might also be considered via televisual formations, as TV is certainly not lacking in representations of presidents. In addition to the real presidents who have appeared on screen, there is also a wide variety of television presidents who have graced screens in the US and around the world, from such programs as The West Wing, Battlestar Galactica, 24, Commander-in-Chief, House of Cards, Scandal, Designated Survivor, and so on. Almost all of those programs can be described as serial melodramas. Like reality TV, an enormously important television form, but one that might offer another model of political media and media politics. The Trump presidency does so far seem very melodramatic, with its hyperbolic rhetoric, its spectacles of morality, or maybe more accurately, immorality, its narrative rhythm of extreme rises and falls, its personalization of political positions, its polarization of views, and its attempt to orchestrate emotion. With all of this, one might argue that the Trump presidency has gone from being a reality competition to a soap opera. But I would suggest that the problem with the Trump presidency is not that it is too much like a TV soap opera, but rather that it is not quite soap opera-like enough, or at least not enough like the soap opera in its most inventive, productive, and progressive mode. For through their ongoing and complex stories, with their webs of characters, multiple and intersecting plot lines, and extended temporality, yet sense of a lived everyday, television soap operas at their best can go beyond the simple good or bad, punished or rewarded, winner or loser structure of traditional melodrama. That is, televisual serialization allows for much more complex constructions. Instead of a simple morality tale, TV soap opera can offer endless reversals, complications, interrelationships, transformations, and crossings. This creates multifaceted, intersectional worlds. Here's just one map of one, and gives viewers who are positioned as both overseeing and immersed, both distant and close, both expansively identifying and fragmented in subject position. It gives viewers a kind of unique vision and understanding, one that the television scholar Tanya Modilewski famously referred to as a maternal consciousness, able to recognize and read, engage and empathize with, critique yet care about all her children. And just to explain that pun, right, for those who don't know the show, All My Children is the name of a famous, though sadly now canceled, soap opera. Of course, the thought of inhabiting a maternal position is likely horrifying to Donald Trump, who wants to be the patriarchal father of his country, probably of the world, even of the universe, but certainly not the mother. Indeed, a palpable gender anxiety yielding an aggressive acting out has been evident from the beginning of Trump's political, and before that and beyond that, his media career. He has tried to carefully cultivate a tough guy persona, using women and possessions, and women as possessions, to bolster his image of success and masculine prowess, appearing most comfortable with women when they are adornments or competing for his favor, whether as potential wives or as contestants in his beauty contest, the Miss Universe pageant, or his reality show, The Apprentice. This attitude carried over from his media to his political persona. His slogan, Make America Great Again, harnesses that fantasy of male prowess and harkens back to an era before women, minorities, foreigners, and others of all kinds challenged the centrality of white men in America. A challenge that Trump, right, sort of self-styled as the ultimate competitor and the American white guy's last hope, right, it's a challenge he can't resist. He seems deeply threatened by female authority, attacking women with political or media power, right, whether Carly Fiorina, his rival in the primary, whose facial appearance he insulted, his electoral rival Hillary Clinton, about whom he said, if she can't satisfy her husband, what makes her think she can satisfy America? Then Fox News anchor and presidential debate host Megyn Kelly, whose debate question about his views on women, he later dismissed by saying, "You could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever." Or other countless instances in which he's insulted or worse, assaulted women. And in the light of my comments on the gendered possibilities of television soap opera, it's worth noting that it was actually while preparing to visit a soap opera set to be guided by the female star of that program, it was while visiting the soap set that Trump made his most egregious remarks about grabbing women's genitals. But for all of his tough talk, Trump's persona is a profoundly insecure one, exhibiting a visceral fear of being seen as emasculated. So just consider, for example, his apparent anxiety over the size of his hands, or his obvious overcompensation in his alpha male handshake competitions with other world leaders. These things have been the subject of much late-night television humor, in which other TV Trumps, those performing comical impressions and impersonations, figure him as weak, insecure, small-handed, and not a full-grown man, castrated, if you will. The most famous of these TV Trumps is that of Alec Baldwin's caricature for the comedy program Saturday Night Live, which has featured skits in which Baldwin's Trump is ordered around by skeletal then chief strategist Steve Bannon, with Trump sent to sit behind a miniature desk and play with a little expandable toy, as Bannon, as Grim Reaper, played by Mikey Day, takes the presidential desk. So that skit, and one where he's placated, among many others, by his former campaign manager, now counselor Kellyanne Conway, played by Kate McKinnon, who coddles him, calls himself his mommy, and tries to make him feel better when he has to face, as they put it, other people, not Trump. Trump seemed angry and upset by these portrayals, tweeting out disparaging messages about the, as he put it, unwatchable Saturday Night Live, and calling for the program's retirement. But the Saturday Night Live portrayal that seemed most to disturb him was not that of Trump himself, but of then press secretary Sean Spicer, played by the comedian Melissa McCarthy in drag. According to reporting, and I'm quoting here, the White House was rattled by McCarthy's spoof of Spicer. More than being lampooned as a press secretary who makes up facts, it was Spicer's portrayal by a woman that was most problematic in the president's eyes, according to sources close to him. Trump doesn't like his people to look weak, added a top Trump donor, with apparently weak equated with female here. How much more upsetting then must it have been for the White House to witness the program promotion in which McCarthy sang "I Feel Pretty," taken from the musical West Side Story to Saturday Night Live's fantasy West Wing, as we see McCarthy transformed from the embodiment of full-on femininity in her pink blouse and flowy, flowery skirt to the pugnacious press secretary Sean Spicer in a bulky suit. And I can show these clips later if people want to see them. Turning the Trump administration into not only a TV melodrama, but a musical and a makeover show, in other words, towards multiplying feminized genres, the skit reveals the gender anxieties and media formations that underpin the Trump presidency. In the face of such portrayals, Trump, who had benefited so much from media formations, declared war on the media, not only wishing for the cancellation of Saturday Night Live and other TV comedy commentary programs, but for the end of numerous news outlets. Earlier I said that with Donald Trump's election, the media won, even if they didn't recognize it. Now, with Trump's threats against the media, right, so his efforts to put certain TV programs or people out of business, his desire to cut all funding to public television, his calls for loosening libel laws and for jailing journalists, his suggestion of ending media briefings, his smears on legitimate reporting as fake news, even as he and his surrogates consistently lie in TV interviews. Right now, in the light of those attacks, the media must win. We must continue to insist on media freedom, expanding that notion beyond mere lip service to fight for a truly open media, which is something now even further threatened by the very recent announcement that the Trump administration's Federal Communication Commission is going to try to relax TV station ownership rules that had previously been used to prevent single companies from totally overtaking entire media markets. Them relaxing that rule will allow Sinclair Broadcasting, very right-wing broadcasting, to take over a dominant proportion of TV stations in the US. So that is going on, and considering digital media too, of course, the FCC's concurrent attack on net neutrality. Right? So we need to continue to fight for these media freedoms against those things, but we also must think carefully about media formations and what they might impede or make possible. The reality televisualization of political discourse, so again, the way that reality television trumped politics, is certainly troubling, but deciding how to respond is no simple matter. Should those who oppose Trump and others like him simply and equally move toward reality televisualization? Should we give up on other modes of discourse, on critical thinking, on civic engagement, instead to operate via the processes of branded and celebrified entertainment? So I would not suggest that as a trend that we should embrace, though I think as a parent from my comments about the potential of certain TV forms like serialized soap opera or like television comedy as commentary, I do think that we can learn from television, particularly since we need to realize that politics are not operating according to old logics anymore. We thus need to engage with media epistemologies and affects, with what Walter Benjamin called aura, here the kind of media-produced aura that he linked to commodity and celebrity culture. While we certainly can't cede political debate, we can no longer just make arguments. We also need to make felt connections, even ones that might start off feeling forced or soapy or fake, like arguably all reality television as well as melodramatic TV programs do, but that become, through our very involvement itself, a new kind of real, right? Real affinity, real participation. In that way, we might at least begin to produce a different kind of mediation, right? Mediation now is intercession or intervention into these media-defined politics and culture. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Really provocative. We have 35 minutes or so. Ben.
This question is for Lynn. Thank you for your great talk. I unfortunately watched all of the Saturday Night Lives from last year. The true, only the first 10 minutes is the good stuff, and then it's all downhill after the fake news. The Weekend Update, I think. So my question is, I'm going to try to connect your talk with Wendy and Joan's talk. The premise, I think, of all of these is that Trump is this facade-like emptiness. Argument is not his strong suit, at least, but also not what his election was about. So that his election is the consequence of a cultural or media logic rather than of traditional political position taking. Yes? But there's more to that. I'll finish my question. Okay.
Yeah,
so that Trump is the consequence of a mediatized persona. This has been the premise of much of the discussion we've had. Trump is the consequence of a mediatized persona. His reality television program, The Apprentice, creates subjects of reality TV desire. He's the beneficiary of an algorithmic logic. Okay, all of this. And so he's the outcome of a cultural or a media logic. He himself has a facade-like emptiness. And it seems what's behind this is that it would be horrible for all of us to think that his positions were popular. that seems to me to be the other consequence, that if he's if his election is the outcome of these impersonal, kind of large, abstract, cultural, media, digitized logics, that he was not elected because his ideas, or whatever you want to call them, won the consent of a majority of voters. But that's usually how we think about elections. And I can name, as I believe I can't for the losing candidate, what Trump's viewpoints were. He wanted to build a wall to keep out immigrants. He believed that Hillary Clinton was criminally corrupt. He thought that Muslims should be banned. He was going to make deals to renegotiate our trade deficits, and he wanted to get lobbyists out of Washington. Those are very clear. So Trump is erratic. Oh, and he's, his main position always, as we were talking about yesterday, anti-black racism. Chicago is a war zone. That may be a very popular but coherent view to people, and I think he came out in all of his debates, in all of his speeches, ran through those things. He was, in a way, a very disciplined candidate in announcing those positions. And it's possible that these things could be synthesized, that both his viewpoints were popular, those viewpoints, and that he was the outcome of impersonal, mediatized, digito-algorithmic logic. But I would like to see these reconciled, because it would be very horrible for us all to say, we are just, we who don't hold those positions are in the minority, or the electoral minority, however it would stand. But I would like to hear this discussed, because the facade-like emptiness of Trump, I can fill him, at least, I who watched the election, I can fill him with these certain bullet points of content. And I wonder what role that played.
So what I would say is I think you're posing something as a binary that I don't see as a binary. So I actually wouldn't say that he's a facade like emptiness. I think that, again, what I was trying to argue is that it's a production of a particular kind of personality that is based on precisely a kind of fullness that he's able to, as I said, stand for himself, his brand image, the public who's invited to identify with that brand. So I do feel like it's, what?
I mean, so you're filling him with a persona and a brand, et cetera, but not with the position.
Well, I think those are related. So again, I don't, see those as unrelated. I would see mediatized culture, whether the way I think about it in terms of reality television or the way Wendy was talking about it, and I do think they go together really well in terms of the kind of, again, as I put it, the medium in which we all live now, like the cultural medium in which our cells are divided, right? So I don't see it as an empty facade or an external placement. I see that as that is the logic of our culture now. So the way that he mobilized certain arguments were within the logic of that. So I certainly wouldn't say he didn't mobilize certain arguments. I mean, as I said, like even the kind of individualist tribalism and tribal individualism, it's a reality TV logic, but then he did mobilize that in very clearly problematic, hugely racialized ways. So for me, again, those things are the medium in which these things happen, but it's not just a sort of peel-off layer or separable facade. So I think that there's a way in which we need to acknowledge this is the logic in which we're operating, and how, therefore, can we best ourselves operate within that medium logic. But I don't feel like media formations are homogeneous. I can't. So I do think that there's different kinds of media formations, and there's ways in which that opens up possibilities as much as it closes them down, right? But I feel like the way that people tried to fight Trump was by disavowing that logic, right? So that people go on TV and they say, but he's lying. Why can't the people see he's lying? Whereas I would argue that's not the point. That's not the logic in which they're even operating. So trying to unveil his lies is not getting at where this operates, right? Instead, we need to think about, as Wendy said too, and I think I'm making the same argument, that there is not there is not a binary between authenticity and artifice. I feel like reality television is precisely about the fact that there is not a binary between authenticity and artifice, and we don't really have the language to talk about that. But when people watch reality television, they very smoothly move in and out of different realities. Right? They know it's fake. They know that, you know, it's all been set up, but they look for the authentic moment. But they also know that that's going to happen because they know about the reality of the production process behind. So there's like the production level, the diegetic level, the affective level, and people move in and out of those in a much smoother way that our language, our kind of coarse binary for that, does not capture. So I feel like it's trying to think about that different construction of artifice and authenticity that can help us then figure out, you know, how do we speak to people who, you know, themselves have certain feelings about the way their lives are going, and that's the reason they're voting those ways. So sorry about that long answer.
So thank you. I'm going to try to put the two together in a certain way. I really did like them both very much. I mean, I think for Lynn, I would ask this question. There seems to be, for me, a kind of disconnect between the nationalism, right, which Trump mobilizes, and everything that you said so brilliantly about his self-presentation, which is absolutely devoid of any kind of national imagery, or, you know, it seems to be so much about the individual, so much, let's say, in a neoliberal realm that has no nationalism involved with it, but it does seem to be a new nationalism. And that's where I would like to make a connection, because I think you're both talking about something really new, something we haven't seen before, and we better understand, because this is the new political reality of the 21st century. It won't go away. All right, but then in John's case, and I actually thought it was extremely effective to read and hear. I tried just listening, and then it didn't work. I had to read it at the same time, so it made your point very well. It was a little nostalgic for the good old days when the goal of universal literacy was valued. I mean, you know, I'm thinking that. I mean, my God, it was only a short period of time from after the French Revolution, maybe until Trump, that the goal of universal literacy was held to be important for democracy and for progress and for everything else good. You know, so it's kind of hard to give that up. But where you then talk about this kind of flatness and this lack, again, of collectivity, which at the end, when these kind of very, very strong statements were made about Trump's total, you know, it's a one-way street. He gives, we get. Whatever collectivity is simply, it isn't the collectivity of language which is produced by multiple readings. However, Lynn, you did talk about this kind of we're in, we're out, we're involved in the communication in a way that is not a one-way street, which is much more visually complicated than that. So, but I think you're both talking, my question is not very good, but I'm trying to bring together these, and let me just maybe say, you know, if we're talking about the newness of the situation, you know, that can't be contained within a previous logic, could you see your way to making some linguistic interconnect between the discourse of the first paper and the discourse of the second?
Well, in terms of the newness of the situation, I think the newness is infrastructural. So in other words, it's perfectly, in the way I'm thinking, I am thinking that Trump reads and uses language in a very restricted dialect, if not a sort of like an idiolect, like literally an idiolect, and that and that he's not a facade. That is really what he reads and how he performs language, and that there is a collectivity that responds to that and that speaks the same language to an extent, and that's a very unprogressive and very uncaring collectivity, and it's also in sort of nightmarish alliance with other sort of powerful entities in political economy. But the infrastructure itself is not necessarily, it could be gamed, right? And can be gamed. The media can be gamed. You can do things with the media, and you can do things with the new infrastructure that the internet provides us with. And the problem is that in the current situation, it's so much easier and so much more obvious for those people who already have the power to be able to do the gaming, and for us to find ways of getting around that is the problem. I haven't said that very well.
I think that the things you said were really interesting. I think there were a couple different things, but to start first with what you were saying about this sort of new nationalism and where that fits or doesn't fit, again, I do think it's really interesting, and to me, it seems like the way that Trump mobilizes that, and not just him, but many leaders now around the world, is exactly like the way that global reality TV formats go around the world, right? So that they're global in that every country now has an idol, American Idol, British Idol, whatever. And they all construct themselves as the nationalists, like the American Idol or the, British pop star. But it's a global format that's going, so that it's both like circulated, but with a totally nationalistic construction, which again I think goes to this tribal individualism sort of thing. So it's a funny way in which, again, I do think that television, for being seen as in a way the most ordinary medium around us, is a very paradoxical medium for the way it brings these things together, crosses all these boundaries, and that I think is one of them. Wendy had brought up a quote during her talk from Laurie Ouellette about reality television and neoliberalism. Actually, Laurie and I are working on something together now in terms of reality television and Donald Trump, but there's a way in which I think that the kind of neoliberal logic that reality television so much trains us in, which is to all be enterprising individuals so that we can, again, make it to the end of the amazing race, right? That there's a way in which it's almost flipping. I feel like that logic is starting to flip into something different almost through the way that it is bringing together the individual with the quote-unquote tribe. So I feel like, again, we don't yet have the language to talk about that. I feel like TV is bringing things together in a way that, but I think that you're right that we better start analyzing that so as to be able to think about the global implications. As to your, just really quick about bringing my paper together with John's, I am not exactly sure, but one thing I would say is I mean, I, as a TV viewer and TV scholar, do believe in reading TV, and I feel like there are certain television forms that demand a more complex reading. Like I would argue, as I'm sure is obvious from my talk, I'm a big fan of soap opera, because I do think that that particular form with multiple intersecting ongoing narratives that all interweave in very complex ways demands a kind of complex reading on the part of, and it's funny that within sort of cultural notions of TV esteem, it was always soap viewers who were seen as like, oh, the dumbest, whereas I would argue, no, that involved incredibly complicated reading of managing to kind of keep multiple narratives in, So I do think that there's ways in which even within media formations, there are some that open up possibilities of reading that some others don't. But sorry, John, you were going to say more.
No, I wanted to chip in, and I wanted to chip in on exactly that point, because the question of the sort of the complexity of soap opera and its narrative and the reversals and which may be in what we might perceive to be in a restricted or not the language that we use in the university, but nonetheless is totally readable and very interesting to read. But definitely those soap operas don't have consequence. And the thing about game shows, reality TV, is that they do, but they only have one consequence, either winning or losing. So the narrative complexity is kind of reduced, and so it's what Trump proposes for the type of reading, the sort of televisual reading of Trump that you would do is much more for me like reality television than like a soap opera, for the reasons that you brought out, right? Because if we're watching it as a soap opera, we'll just get bored and we'll stop watching. And we know that, and we kind of know that the only consequence is that they will win, right? And who wants that? So.
Okay, we have 7 people want to get in. We have about a quarter of an hour, just to let you know how things are looking. Akil.
Lynn, I was just thinking as you were speaking, you said 2 things which were quite moving to me. First was that we've simply got to do something about it. We can't give up on the media, and we can't give up on television. And also pointing out when you started about how one oughtn't to run away with the impression that television isn't central anymore. Hasn't been overtaken by all the social media and the new media. Now, I'd like to ask you to step away from the United States for a moment and just reflect on, and then come back and pursue what you said when you said we can't give up on the media. The Arab Spring couldn't have happened if it wasn't for one television station. One television station has changed the map of the Middle East. I mean, the human map of the Middle East. And it's done this with complete sobriety. Right? It's just beamed in for about, I mean, Al Jazeera is a very bad institution now, but for about 10 to 12 years in the 90s, it beamed in every single day into the drawing rooms of ordinary people. Just how corrupt and just heinous the regimes and elites were in their countries. Just, mostly by giving information, not even by a whole lot of, rhetoric or propaganda. I used to see this. Edward Said used to get this thing, so we would see it from time to time in his home. And they really had tremendous consequences in the Middle East. Of course, it all went down the drain with the counter-revolution. But it was a remarkable thing. And I'm just curious as to how they found the language and so on to do this with that sobriety and seriousness and have that effect. I mean, one of the things that Joan in her paper pointed out was how much the entire discourse, neoliberalism and its effects, has so much shaped the discourse that we really don't have a language of dissent anymore, because you've got Hillary Clinton as the savior if Trump is bad, and the whole game seems to be rigged. And so the frivolousness and the madness and the semi-fascism and so on seem, just things to turn to if there's just no discourse for the ordinary forms of dissent. And so the challenge you pose, we mustn't give up on media, is a real challenge, which I was wondering if you'd think about Al Jazeera and then come to some reflections on that.
Yeah, just quickly, I would say I absolutely agree with you, and for me, that's why we need to argue for diversity in media. I mean, the way that, ownership rules are being these are global, corporate transnational, transmedia corporations. There's basically 6 of them that own almost between the 6, every single media outlet in the world practically, right? And it's a huge problem. People have no idea how much, Comcast owns, or Disney, or Comcast, Disney, Verizon, CB. I mean, it's astounding around the world. So it is a global issue. And that's why I think that, the importance of having multiple voices in media is crucial. And I think of, I don't think of social media and, things like YouTube, et cetera, as opposed to television. I feel like they're so interwoven now. I mean, the main thing that people do on, again, studies have shown the main use that people make of things like YouTube and even, is to look at clips from TV, right? So that they're totally, the television makes up the majority of everything going on the web, other than one thing which beats it out, which you can all probably guess, pornography. Other than that, television is the top thing on the internet. So, I think that those things all go together, and the fact that, we're soon gonna lose net neutrality and any way for these alternative voices to get out there, now that we've already lost the TV ownership caps, it's hugely troubling.
Could we take 2 questions at a time? So Claire and Elizabeth, please. Oh, sorry? Okay. Claire and then Rebecca.
So my question is about, I think it might actually resonate with some of the things that have already been said, but hopefully it's not repetitive. So it's about, I love how you ended, Lynn, on how to respond, right? And I think a lot of the conversation right now is also about answering that question. And how you began, John, made us respond by laughter to an extent, right? We started laughing when you said that Trump couldn't read. And then very quickly, there's a feeling, I think, around the room of gravity and, severity of the problem, right? So, I oscillate between wanting to laugh and wanting to cry through watching, and especially, this is probably the most Trump imaging that I've received in the last month, because I tend to, and before Trump's election anyway, I already did that, is I tend to rely on written, press and then radio. So, could one response, I guess is what I'm asking, could one response beyond the laughter and crying temptation be perhaps something like an image strike? And what would that look like? Because you both talked, John, you talked about uncaring collectivity, and Lynn, you talked about not just making arguments, but making connection. How could we just go on and ignore the bully campaign and try to proliferate, not an image strike in terms of going away from all images, but going away from all the images that have to do with Trump, creating absence instead of his omnipresence. How could we perhaps do that? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think that you're right that in some ways I did the opposite, which was Trump excess, but I tried to interrupt the image by actually showing pictures of his image being distorted. But I think your idea of an image strike is a really interesting one, and I would love to think about how that could work, or an image replacement, so yeah. This is why it's so ironic that he attacks the media so much. They do him such enormous service by endlessly, which of course he knows, and the more he attacks the media, the more he knows that they will report on him. So it is this cycle, and it would be, to break that logic and do a different one would be really intriguing. What do you think, John?
Well, yes. Well, I don't think it's funny at all. I really don't. And I think that it's a matter of communities, linguistic communities, which is my main sort of point of attention. So institutions that foster communities of linguistic practice that are, and I don't just mean things like the university. I do mean places where people get together to use language of all types. And which inherently opposes this sort of the monomaniacal restricted dialect, and then there is this profound problem of the infrastructure which is provided to us for language, and we just can't get around that. It will change because in my view, this is a little bit of futurism, that now that we have listening and talking devices, that those, as it were, they add a whole extra layer of a whole realm of difference and of access that the infrastructure will have to aspects of tone and affect and humor and nuance. And so there is a moment now where we can become aware that that's happening and get a hold of it, because that's supposed to be what we're really good at, right? We're supposed to be the people who understand nuance and affect and all those interesting aspects of linguistic practice. So we should be trying to get ahead of the engineers. I mean, it's more or less impossible, seeing as the computer science department in this university is the biggest, and that they're all totally gung-ho. They're not even going to think about for a minute these issues. But nonetheless, it's down to us to figure out how to rein them in and get them to be engineering for us rather than against us, or maybe not against us, but to engineer for us and various sort of lumpy collectivities rather than for a particular tiny 1% collectivity of people that will have more frictionless transactions.
Rebecca?
I really took out of these really great papers, and also the papers earlier, the idea not that this is a new situation, right? Not that it's, like Susan says, entirely new, but that there is an invitation to really think that not the newness of Trumpism. And there's so many ways in which his agendas and the white supremacists that surround him are nothing new, and are actually, simply, it's not simple at all, but reemergences of a latency that perhaps the logics of something like reality television allows to come to some kind of fore. And you use words like melodrama, which is also nothing new. What was the logics of melodrama at a particular moment, right? Had everything to do with settler colonial kinds of moment of industrial capital expansionism. And we use language of tragedy, and it reminded me of, in another year, I don't remember which year it was, when Jacques Calip's word was triumph, and the kind of long march of triumphalism, which out of empiric triumphalism, which is, which its signature was the triumphal arch, which is a bicameral machine, much like an early screen. It's almost like an early television. And that what we're invited, I think, to think is not just the newness of this situation, but the kinds of trappings of a particular long march of a particular empire. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm very wanted to also make a reminder about the sort of greatness of literacy. No, not when we look at the sort of universalizing tendency of deciding who is literate and who isn't, and who is to take up literacy and who doesn't have it, in the racialized agenda of colonialism. So yeah, that's kind of a rant, maybe, but I'm grateful for you allowing me to make.
I could respond to that a bit, because I hope that there was a part of the paper that I presented that was a critique of restricted literacy, right? Precisely the type of thing that has inordinate sway in places like the university.
I think I was responding to Susan on that one, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to take could I take 6 comments, and then we'll have the 2 speakers to respond. I mean, right? That sounds good, I think. So, not that I want to be, Matt Lauer on with respect to, Hillary Clinton. Anyway, sorry, God, Brian, and then Peter, and then I'm not sure what your name is. Sorry? Kareem, thank you.
I'm not sure if mine is something of a rant too, but very quickly, it relates to the whole question of nationalism, which Susan brought up, and which I don't think is captured, Lynn, mainly in your paper, sufficiently, the extent to which there is something new about his nationalism, his white nationalism, because maybe it's American nationalism too, and the two are conflated. But what I think what strikes me is the absence of any gesture reaching out to other groups outside of his core his very core alliance. If you think about African Americans, for example, how easy it would have been, and probably still is for Trump, to try to search for those fault lines of religion, of anti-LGBTQ sentiments, which might exist and, divide off sections of the African American, foreign, newly arrived black people versus people who have been in America, are Americans for many generations. There's so many fault lines that if you wanted to build an alliance, you could. So what I think is new and is really the extent to which his agenda works closely with that of the most extreme wing of white nationalism. And in its failure to attempt to build alliances of any kind whatsoever. And it comes back to the point I was trying to make yesterday, that is this an attempt to build a majoritarian alliance, or is it an attempt to work within a minority and achieve power via institutional measures which don't require a majority, a functioning majority to carry out those measures?
I was struck by your two papers. Thank you for a specific reason that came to my mind. I was thinking that in a way, reading and television are two oppositional concepts. I mean, television, it is often said, replaces reading or supposedly is antinomical. So I was thinking about reading on television, or as portrayed or not portrayed on television, and I was thinking specifically of the use of teleprompters, which is very striking because in a way people are reading on TV, but the very apparatus of television sort of cancels and makes the very act of reading completely transparent. And invisible. So I guess my specific question would be, do you know if Donald Trump uses teleprompters? If he does, in what situations, what for? And more generally, maybe on TV shows, what is the role, the statistical importance of the use of maybe teleprompters, or more generally the reading of scripts? So what is it of reading that disappears in television but that is present?
Yeah, okay. Karim. Oh yeah, Wale.
Thank you both for excellent papers. And this is going to be a question for both of you, though, beginning with John a bit, around questions of reading, distraction, and attention. First, when we began all laughing at the idea that Trump does not read, I was taken back to an important essay that Teju Cole wrote in The New Yorker in 2013 called A Reader's War, in which he examined what it meant that our presumptions for what reading does is to have empathy for others, and what that meant in particular with the most sophisticated intellectual president we had had in many years, with Obama, who is known as a great reader of cosmopolitan literature. And obviously contrast that with what came before, with George W. Bush. So to say that this is an ongoing sort of critique of the anti-intellectual president who does not read, which also should be challenged by, on the other hand, the intellectual president who does read both deeply, it seems, and widely, and nonetheless continues more or less the same policies regarding the war on terror, regarding deportation, many other issues in which Obama resembled Bush quite a bit. So does reading really edify if we're talking about political radical change in any way? Then also, I think, John, you were right to point out, he gives us a lot to read, right? We're always guessing at Trump's intentions, in part because of his own lack of literacy and what that makes us presume about what he's capable of. And one of the sort of tropes that I think has come up a lot since the election is that of his causing distraction. He is saying this outrageous thing so that we pay attention to that rather than the material bad thing that the GOP is pushing through. An example within the last week would be Wednesday morning, Trump tweets crazy Islamophobic fascist propaganda from Britain First. And what's really happening in the meantime is that the GOP is going through with class war in the way that they would have anyway. But we are supposed to choose, in a sense, which we pay attention to. Is that really an example of distraction? Should we accept that? What should we think about in terms of our own attention and our own reading at that moment? And does this connect to kind of the TV structures and the televisual logics that you were describing, Lynn, especially when you said there's a kind of complexity to the serial soap opera? Yeah, so that's just a question about how to read distraction there.
Thank you. And I think you have mostly asked the questions I want to ask as well. So my original question is that Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, right? So I'm just wondering if today we had, like Clinton edition, are we going to change all the parameters at all? So what is reality? Is this reading or TV? Do they function reading? Yeah, the same way, no matter who finally won. So it's a more general reality. I mean, in terms of authenticity, in terms of individual identification. If he won the popular votes, I thought most individuals still identify with her, right? In a way, right? So how does that work for us to understand? What's the, perhaps, it's a wrong question, but what really made the difference toward the end? Is it the concept we are talking here now? Is it the reading? Is it TV, right? Or nothing is predictable, right? If, for example, Clinton won, so what are we going to reflect on, reality, which are we still thinking, it's still quite, neoliberal, right? There's no big difference, so that's my question. I think,
Actually, this is follows on a little bit from what Lynn is saying. I suppose, thank you both very much. It's a question perhaps for John, and it comes out of confusion about partly the, in a broader sense about our discussion here about the exceptionality of Trump, which is starting to just seem a little bit confusing. And and this panel sort of clarified that. I think it's very important to talk about Trump, but in isolation when there are far worse sort of tyrants out there emerging at the same time has seemed troubling as a shadow over our discussion. And I suppose, John, in your analysis, I started to wonder who the linguistic community is that one can refer to whilst making a judgment about an entity like Trump. And I appreciate your Derridean gloss, but that takes us to one very particular paradigm about the relationship of orality and writing. And I, just to put this plainly, should we be talking only about Trump? That's a question for the day. And number two, insofar as we are talking about Trump, and regrettably or otherwise, Trump is an American president with a global audience, witness the protests against him. Do we make judgments about language, apropos Trump, in a only with reference to a particular tradition or a particular linguistic community? Or do we need to then refer to global understandings of linguistic community or global understandings of language use or speech and writing, silence even?
Just one last question from Françoise, then we will have to close down, apart from one word from John.
Well, thank you. Just about reading, it's perhaps a naive question, but how do you fit with the fact that in the world, a lot of people don't have access to books just because they don't have access to books. Books don't arrive there, I mean, all over the world. I mean, so, and they don't read, but so it's not the same of readiness. And then it's more general, so it's not just to both speakers, but it follows on this question of like the exception, I mean, of Trump. I remember when Trump was elected, there was other reaction. In France, among my friends from Africa or among the children of post-colonial migration, it was, they were happy. It was some kind of a joie mauvaise. Now they're going to get a taste of their own medicine. They deserve this guy. They will, and when I remarked that the first victim would be African American and gay and minorities or indigenous people, they told me, but we have been the victim of, of this nastiness forever. So why should we feel any empathy for these people? And the other remark also I will bring to the general conversation is like this idea of that the worst will bring the good, And so, because people will revolt, and it follows, it's still about Trump. This happened in France between Macron and Le Pen, when, Macron and Marine Le Pen. So the choice of Macron was a choice of decency, at least a decent someone. And I want to show, Macron would constantly present himself as the opposite of Trump. He tweets against Trump. He reads. He has been close to a philosopher, Paul Ricoeur. He quotes Paul Ricoeur. He is a feminist. He loves women. He even, married an older one to show that, He even declared that colonialism is bad, has been a crime against humanity. He's not a patriarch. So I want to bring in, in the question of nastiness, the form of nastiness, that there are other forms of brutality and nastiness, and that if we bring always Trump, it will mask, because his nastiness is so big that someone like Macron will appear, at least, at least he can speak, he can make a full sentence, and he read and he quote Ricoeur every 5 minutes. So I wanted just to bring in this question of, the different form of nastiness today, and how Macron is also pushing for terrible politics right now, but in the disguise, so it was just that, because the focus on Trump nastiness masks this form of nastiness,
No. Okay, sorry. Thank you, we're out of time. Thanks, wonderful papers, wonderful comments. They'll all be tabled. We have lunch now for an hour and 10 minutes or so. We reconvene here at 2:40. Thank you.